That youngest daughter over there, I will take her as my wife. As a reward for saving the life of a dying old lord, the poor parish scholar chose the plain-looking youngest daughter. Before his eyes stood the eldest and second daughters, both as beautiful as spring flowers. Yet the poor scholar did not give them a single glance. He pointed directly at the plain youngest daughter. His elderly mother clicked her tongue, wondering where on earth he had brought him. Such a wretched-looking thing from. But no one knew that this plain wife would completely overturn the destiny of their entire family. What in the world happened? The astonishing tale of a poor scholar who saw the true value hidden beneath outward appearances begins right now. Once upon a time, in the Middle Ages, at the edge of a remote English village, stood a weathered, thatched cottage in lonely isolation. The rotting straw on the roof was giving way in patches, leaking whenever the rains came, and the wattle and daub walls were so cracked that the bitter wind seeped through without mercy. Yet from this humble timber cottage, the sound of village children reciting their letters rang out clearly every single day. Thomas, a young and poor parish scholar who lived with his elderly mother, Martha, was the master of this house. In those days, it was not uncommon for impoverished scholars to open a small parish school in their parlor just to keep starvation at bay. Thomas, too, was an upright young man who taught the children their alphabet by day, and by night he studied relentlessly by the flickering light of a tallow candle, hoping to one day earn a prestigious appointment from the bishop as a diocesan chancellor. The meager tuition the children brought, a measure of oats, a bundle of firewood, or a small lump of wax, was the only thing keeping this household afloat. On that particular day, as the morning lessons ended, the children shyly placed a small wedge of hard cheese and a few scraps of parchment at the edge of the floorboards before hurrying home. Thomas carefully gathered the items and suddenly looked up at the wooden shutters. The heavy rain from the night before had soaked through the cracks, leaving the wood damp and drafty. I must find some fresh straw to mend the roof. And we are out of the rare medicinal roots from the apothecary for Mother's sickness. Calculating the few pennies he had left in his mind, Thomas decided he needed to make a trip to the market square. Inside the cottage, Martha was scraping the bottom of an empty iron pot with a wooden spoon, letting out a deep, heavy sigh. The sound of reading is loud and clear, but the hearth fire is about to die out first. If only a quick-handed wife would come into this house, we might finally be able to breathe. At Martha's grumbling, Thomas offered no reply. He simply washed the empty clay medicine cup and set it upside down to dry. Then, picking up his worn woolen hood, he spoke quietly. I will be back before the rain worsens. It was a walk of about 3 miles to the market square. Thomas quickly purchased a bundle of medicinal roots and some fresh straw for the roof, then began his journey back. But just as he was leaving the town, the light spring rain suddenly turned into a torrential downpour, terrifyingly swelling the river that ran past the village. It happened in a flash. An old man walking ahead of him lost his footing on the slippery stepping stones. With a violent lurch, The old man's body plunged into the raging, muddy water. A scream pierced the air. By the time Thomas looked up, the old man had already been swept away by the fierce rapids and was barely clinging to a jagged boulder jutting out in the middle of the river. The rough current pounded against his body over and over, and it was clear that the terrified old man's grip was rapidly failing. Thomas did not hesitate. He threw his bundle of straw and medicinal roots onto a nearby rock and quickly scanned his surroundings. A gnarled old willow tree standing firm by the water's edge caught his eye. Thomas pulled out the long coil of thick hemp rope he had bought at the market. To tie the roof thatch, he frantically unspooled the rope, tying one end securely around the thick trunk of the willow tree, and wrapped the other end tightly around his own waist. After testing the rope to ensure it would hold taut, Thomas plunged fearlessly into the raging, muddy water. "My lord, take my hand!" The waist-deep rapids crashed over the two men. With every step, the gravel beneath his boots was swept away, and the splashing water blinded him. But Thomas, relying entirely on the strength of the rope tied to the willow tree, pushed forward with all his might, one agonizing step at a time. The old man squeezed out the very last of his strength and reached out his hand. The moment their freezing fingertips met, Thomas grabbed the old man's wrist and pulled with everything he had. The current whipped around his ankles, and sharp stones battered his shins. But Thomas gritted his teeth and forced his way back toward the riverbank. After a desperate struggle, Thomas dragged the old man out of the water. He patted the man's back to help him cough up the swallowed river water, then took off his own soaked woolen cloak and draped it over the old man's trembling shoulders. Then, hoisting the exhausted man onto his back, Thomas ran through the pouring rain all the way to his thatched cottage. Seeing her son burst through the door, Martha was startled, but she quietly built up the fire in the hearth without a word of complaint. She peeled off the stranger's soaked leather shoes and rubbed his freezing feet, helping his body regain its warmth. A bowl of warm barley broth was slowly fed past the old man's shivering lips. Only after a long while did the old man recover enough strength to speak, his voice trembling. "If it were not for you, young scholar, I would have become a ghost in that river today. My debt to you is as high as a mountain." Thomas waved his hand, as if to say it was nothing. But the old man glanced around every corner of the bleak, impoverished cottage and continued, "My name is John. I was once a wealthy lord of the manor, but as you can see, I am now just a ruined old lord living on the next estate, doing nothing but reading old books. I had gone out trying to borrow some silver coins, and I nearly ended up at the bottom of the river. Looking closely, I see you are of an age to be wed. Yet it seems you have no wife by your side. Though I do not have the wealth to repay my debt to you with gold, I have 3 daughters at home. I will give you one of them in marriage. Please do not refuse." Thomas hastily tried to decline, but Martha's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. The next morning, John left detailed directions to his estate in the neighboring village, urging Thomas to be sure to visit, before taking his leave. As soon as John's figure disappeared over the hill, Martha forcefully pushed her sons back. "Even just one more pair of hands will save this house. What are you hesitating for? Go at once." Thomas looked up at the leaking thatched roof. When he turned his head, his eyes fell upon his mother's cold medicine cup. In a corner of his heart that had always believed passing the Episcopal, disputation was the only priority. The heavy weight of reality settled in like a stone. A few days later, forcing his reluctant feet to move, Thomas set out on the road toward John's estate. Following the directions he was given, Thomas arrived at the neighboring village. He was told it was the home of a nobleman, but there was no grand stone hall to be seen. Instead, two crumbling timber cottages stood facing each other, and the wattle and daub walls had collapsed in several places, clearly revealing their impoverished state. Thomas smiled bitterly to himself. It was no different from his own home. As he approached the wooden gate, the sharp voices of women leaked out from inside. "Marry into the house of a starving parish scholar? I must be mad. Sister, you go. I absolutely refuse." Hearing the sound of them bickering and pushing the burden onto each other, Thomas stopped in his tracks. As he hesitated, wondering whether he should enter or turn back, John hurriedly ran out, his face lighting up with joy as he welcomed him. "Oh, Master Thomas, please come in, come in." Before stepping up to the main hall, another sound drifted into Thomas's ears through a crack in the kitchen door. Even if Father is grabbed by the throat by coin lenders, how can noble maidens scheme to sell their needlework at the market like low-born peasants? Do you wish to smear mud on Father's name? It was the sound of someone slapping a surface, followed by a harsh scolding. Then a quiet but clear voice replied, "The granary is completely empty right now. Does noble pride feed us bread? Look at me. If I act so lowly, what house would ever take me as a wife?" A clicking of the tongue followed, and then the kitchen fell silent. Thomas pretended not to notice, averting his gaze as he stepped up into the hall. John laid out a cushion in the parlor, seated Thomas, and then called his 3 daughters out, one by one. The eldest, Isabel, was 19 years old. She wore a faded wool dress, but her features were striking and beautiful, though she lacked any pretty ribbons in her neatly braided hair. Her sheer elegance was more than enough to draw anyone's eye. The second daughter, Alice, was 18, a true beauty with peach-colored cheeks and cherry-red lips. Standing side by side, the 2 sisters were so radiant that one could not help but sigh in admiration. However, there was not a single trace of welcome in the eyes of the 2 older daughters. It was painfully obvious that they were secretly hoping for a much wealthier match. Finally, the youngest daughter stepped out, Jane. The 17-year-old youngest sister was vastly different from her older siblings. She had a tanned face, rough features, and spoke so little that if she stood in a corner, she was plain enough to go completely unnoticed. John cleared his throat awkwardly and added, "Jane may lack a bit in looks, but she has a gentle heart and capable hands." Making a mockery of those words, Isabel glared at her sister and spoke up. "Father, The tea is cold. Jane, go fetch some more at once." Alice, too, checked her hair in a small mirror and spoke bluntly. "The water is cold. Hurry and boil it again." Jane nodded without a single word of complaint, quietly picked up the wooden tray and headed toward the hearth. Thomas sat quietly in his seat, pretending to sip his herbal tea while keeping a watchful eye on the room. The two older sisters sat gracefully in the hall, but whenever there was a chore to be done, they reflexively pointed their fingers at Jane. When the cold wind blew in, it was Jane who blocked the drafty wooden shutters. When John coughed, it was Jane who was the first to bring him a cup of warm water. The scattered shoes by the door and the messy cushions on the floor had all been neatly organized by Jane's hands before anyone even noticed. Thomas's gaze grew sharp. It was not the vain, beautiful older sisters who caught his attention, but the busy movements of that plain youngest daughter, constantly moving between the kitchen and the well, while the older sisters were completely consumed with keeping up appearances. Jane was tirelessly patching the holes of this sinking household. Without that girl, this house would stop running this very instant. Thomas nodded to himself. He instantly saw through the truth. The real engine keeping this family alive was not the two sisters with their beautiful faces, but that plain youngest daughter, working silently with her rough, calloused hands. Having finished all the hard chores, Jane returned to the corner of the hall and sat down, her head bowed low. Thomas's eyes lingered on Jane's hands. He saw the back of her hands, chapped and swollen from the cold well water, and her fingers thick with calluses from being pricked by sewing needles. Right at that moment, John spoke up cautiously. "Well, Master Thomas, which maiden pleases you?" As John's question fell, a strange tension filled the room. Isabel and Alice held their breath and turned their heads away. It was painfully obvious how terrified they were of being chosen, fidgeting nervously. The thought that they would rather grow old as spinsters than marry a starving parish scholar was written plainly across their faces. Jane did not even look in Thomas's direction, assuming her name would never be called anyway. She simply stared down at the wooden floorboards in resignation. A brief silence flowed through the room. Thomas opened his mouth. His voice was firm, without a single trace of hesitation. "I will take your youngest daughter as my wife." In that instant, an unconcealable wave of relief washed over the faces of Isabel and Alice. The corners of their mouths twitched upward before they quickly turned their heads to exchange knowing, smug glances. They looked as if a rotten tooth had just been pulled. But Jane, the one who had actually been chosen, did not even realize he was talking about her. It was only when John, with a look of sheer surprise, pointed at his youngest daughter that she finally snapped her head up. Jane's eyes grew wide as saucers, her lips trembling in absolute disbelief. "Yes? Me?" John could not hide his bewildered expression either. He carefully asked Thomas, "Nay, good scholar, you choose my youngest, who I thought would never find a match in her lifetime. You are not taking her merely to work her like a scullery maid, are you?" As a father, how could he not ask? She was a plain daughter, but of his own blood. and he worried she might be treated like a lowly servant. Thomas did not offer long excuses. Looking at John with steady eyes, he answered calmly, "To have your youngest daughter by my side is more than enough for me."
At that firm resolve, John soon nodded. His eyes grew hot with tears at
The fact that someone had finally recognized his daughter's true worth. But he tried to hide it by clearing his throat. As soon as Thomas left, the two older sisters made a fuss. Heavens! Is the parish scholar blind? Still, what a relief. The ugly one is going instead of us! Amidst the sisters laughing and giggling, Jane silently headed to the backyard. As if to steady her bewildered heart, she lifted a heavy wooden pail of water. Her roughened hands were trembling ever so slightly. A few days later, the wedding day dawned. Thomas was in no position to hire a proper carriage or an escort. He borrowed a clean wool tunic from a village elder and chose the most reliable boy among his parish students, handing him a rooster wrapped in red cloth to carry as the traditional wedding offering. Martha, excited that a working hand was finally coming, stayed alone in the thatched cottage to prepare for her new daughter-in-law. She dusted the cramped room and set soaked barley in the iron pot over the hearth. The lonely wedding procession, consisting of only Thomas and the young student, who stepped up to help his master, made its way toward John's ruined manor. In John's courtyard, there were no grand tapestries or roasted meats. There was no fine wedding gown either. Jane had changed into a faded but cleanly mended linen gown and combed her hair up neatly under a simple coif, readying herself. Before a modest wooden table holding only a single wooden cup of pure spring water, the two faced each other. The ceremony was simple in the cold stone church, but they did not skip the sacred vows. It was the rite where man and woman joined hands and shared a cup of ale to forge their marital bond. Jane's roughened hand was carefully placed over Thomas's hand. It was a cold and trembling hand. Thomas gently supported it. After the church wedding, custom dictated that the groom should stay at the bride's home for a few days. But considering Thomas's situation of leaving his elderly mother behind, it was decided they would depart for his home that very day. Leaving immediately after the ceremony was a harsh necessity. Before they left, John tightly squeezed his plain youngest daughter's rough hand and wiped his reddened eyes. A hard road lies ahead of you. Still, he is a man who saw your true worth, so put your trust in him. Jane silently bowed her head. Without even a wooden cart to ride in, Jane silently followed behind her husband, Thomas, clutching only an old cloth bundle and a wooden sewing box to her chest. The spring wind blew and fluttered the hem of the bride's cloak, but no one looked back. As the sun began to set, the three arrived at Thomas's thatched cottage. Martha stepped out to the threshold with a welcoming face. However, the moment she saw the face of the daughter-in-law who had walked in, without a horse or carriage, her expression froze into ice. A dark, sun-baked face, plain features, and a shabby appearance. Nowhere in Martha's eyes was the daughter-in-law she had expected. "Is this supposed to be my daughter-in-law?" A cold remark fell from her lips. Jane kept her head bowed and bit her lip. That night, Jane laid a wool blanket in the corner of the cramped room, but she could not rest. Her mother-in-law's cold glare kept appearing in the darkness. The next morning, before the dawn broke, Jane was the first to rise. She cleared the ashes from the hearth fire, filled the wooden pails at the village well, and stoked the flames to warm the cottage. Even without being told, she moved without rest. Martha woke and stepped out, seeing her daughter-in-law working busily. Her movements were precise, and her skills were quite good. Yet, instead of showing any sign of approval, Martha spoke coldly. With a face as frightful as that? You had better work like an ox. Fetch more water. The washing is piled up, and you haven't even finished. Clearing the hearth ashes, from tending to the cellared root vegetables and salted meats to sweeping the muddy yard, there was not a moment of rest all day. Yet Jane did not pout or complain once. While she worked silently, her eyes never rested. She observed the order of baking bread, the exact time to brew Martha's herbal tea, and the paths the parish students took when they came and went. She closely examined where resources were leaking and where time was wasted. My mother-in-law's cough is worst at the break of dawn. I must stoke the hearth fire a little earlier. The students grow hungry by midday and cannot focus on their letters. I must feed them something in the morning. Jane etched every drafty crack and need of this shabby thatched cottage into her mind. Meanwhile, marriage proposals flew in for Isabel and Alice. Because rumors of their great beauty had spread, fine matches lined up for the older sisters. The eldest, Isabel, was married off to the only son of a wealthy merchant guild, a master who dealt in fine silks in the capital. Oh my! A grand estate in the city? I never knew my fate would be this blessed. Isabel hummed a tune as she climbed into a fine carriage. The second daughter, Alice, married the second son of a wealthy landowner in a neighboring shire. It was a famously rich household, said to own hundreds of acres of manor fields with granaries overflowing with wheat. Jane went to a drafty thatched cottage, but I shall live in a stone manor, wearing velvet gowns, Alice spat out triumphantly. John was entirely penniless, but fortunately, the wealthy in-laws took care of all the wedding expenses, allowing him to marry off his two daughters grandly, without spending a single penny from his own hands. John finally breathed a sigh of relief. But even then, no one knew who the truly devoted daughter was. Then one day, an unexpected gift arrived for Jane. John, who could not shake the guilt that his youngest daughter had left with nothing, while her sisters, married into grand homes, scraped together what little he had. He sent a newly bought wooden sewing box and a handful of copper pennies he had, painstakingly saved. Jane held those coins in her hand and thought for a long time. Buying barley or firewood was an urgent need, but Jane made a different choice. She searched the corners of the muddy market square's cloth stalls and bought scraps of fine velvet and linen that noblemen had discarded after having gowns made, along with a bundle of colorful threads. Seeing the bundle, Martha flew into a rage. The grain sack is empty, and you waste money on wicked scraps of velvet. What place does such luxury have in a poor scholar's home? Thunderous scolding poured down, but Jane only quietly bowed her head instead of making excuses. From that night on, after finishing her grueling chores, Jane sat by the light of a tallow candle and picked up her needle. Jane did not simply make pretty things. She recalled the temperaments and worn tunics of the parish students coming and going from the lessons, choosing the perfect colors for each child. She pieced together the scrap fabrics and began to embroider exquisite patterns. A few days later, several beautifully crafted pen cases and small pouches attached to their book satchels were finished, each one unique in the world. Jane sat on the wooden porch of the cottage and carefully sewed the pouches onto the children's frayed satchels, one by one. When the exquisite, brightly colored pouches were attached to their shabby belongings, the excited students rushed home and proudly showed them off to their mothers. Among them, a few wealthy noblewomen immediately recognized the extraordinary color combinations and masterful embroidery of the pouches. Within a few days, one of the students' mothers sent a heavy load of work through a maidservant. I heard the scholar's wife has the finest skills. My lady wishes for you to sew embroidered tapestries and pillowcases for her. Daughter's wedding trousseau. Can you do it? It was an order for expensive, custom wedding items meant to satisfy the discerning eyes of a noble household. Carefully examining the fine velvet and silk scraps handed over by the maid, Jane replied calmly, without a hint of hesitation. Please tell your lady that I will pour my heart into crafting them. Martha, who had been watching in disbelief, was secretly astonished that precious, noble work had found its way to her plain daughter-in-law. But soon, fearing her daughter-in-law might make a mistake, she added a sharp word and coughed. It is for a high-born house. If even a single stitch is out of place, it will bring shame upon our family. Under Martha's piercing gaze, Jane calmly selected her threads and mapped out her designs. Finally, the completed embroidery was sent out, and a few days later, the payment arrived. Sacks of white wheat, a pouch of silver coins, beans, and firewood. The empty granary bin began to fill, and the rare medicine for Martha, which had run out, was restocked. Martha still grumbled with her words, saying since her face was plain, she ought to at least have clever hands. But in front of the plentiful dining table, she could no longer drive Jane so harshly. The air in the cottage had subtly begun to change. Thus, the orders from noble ladies began to come in steadily. Jane did not stop there. She took a portion of the money earned from her sewing and began to support the parish school. She sealed the drafts in the study, room's wooden shutters with thick parchment, and made quilted cushions out of scrap cloth for the cold stone floor where the students' knees rested. Above all, Jane looked after the children. Every dawn, she woke early to boil thin oat porridge, feeding the youngest students first, into the hands of children who came without breakfast. She pressed at least a handful of roasted nuts. Are you not cold? Have a bowl of porridge before you go in. At her warm words, the children's eyes sparkled. A room with warmth and a bowl of porridge to fill their bellies. That alone changed things. The children who used to sniffle in the cold and run home early disappeared. They stayed in their seats until lessons were over, and the sound of reading letters began to overflow outside the cottage. Rumors spread among the parents. They say the parish scholar's wife cares for the children as if they were her own. If you send them to that school, they learn not just their letters, but how to be good people. As praise grew, the number of students increased dramatically. In gratitude, the parents began to send noticeably generous tuitions each season. 1 sack of wheat became 2, and 1 bundle of firewood grew to 3 or 4. As firewood, grain, parchment, and ink no longer ran dry, Thomas's school, which had merely been struggling to survive, finally took the shape of a stable place of learning. Martha clicked her tongue, saying Jane was feeding mouths of other people's children. But seeing the payment piling up in the granary, she quietly let her words trail off. She could not help but secretly admit that her daughter-in-law's foresight was a step above her own. Thomas carefully observed the reason behind the sudden improvement in his school's circumstances. The warmed room, the well-fed children, the increased number of students. At the center of all these changes was Jane. That evening, Thomas approached Jane as she sat at the edge of the hearth. "Thanks to you, my wife, this parish school has found its warmth," he said. It was his first truly heartfelt greeting to her. Jane, unaccustomed to such tenderness, could not bring herself to smile right away. She merely gripped the wooden spoon she used to stir the barley porridge and bowed her head slightly. Yet she could not hide the deep crimson flush spreading to the tips of her ears. A few days later, Jane went to the muddy market square to collect some new linen for her embroidery. As she passed the apothecary stalls, she stopped in her tracks. Unusually high stacks of burlap sacks caught her eye. The grumbling voices of the merchant guild's hired men reached her ears. The peasant carts brought too much of this medicinal white willow bark. We have to empty the storehouses, even if we sell the old stock for a few copper pennies. The moment she heard those words, Jane's gaze fixed upon the neglected pile of herbs. To think that this common healing bark, an essential ingredient in every apothecary's remedy, was being sold for mere pennies. Jane absent-mindedly looked up at the heavily overcast sky. A damp wind brushed against her nose. A long, dreary season of heavy rains was about to begin. When the storms hit, even the price of common cabbage would soar. If the muddy cart roads and river crossings were washed out, would this common medicine be any different? Her heart fluttered slightly, but Jane tightly gripped the folds of her wool dress and walked away. Knowing she did not yet understand the ways of the market square, she could not rashly spend her hard-earned silver coins. Instead, Jane lingered near the apothecary stalls on the next market day, and the one after that. She kept her ears and eyes open, watching how many sacks disappeared in a few days and how the merchants haggled. Over shillings, she was learning the flow of the town's trade. Late at night, sitting beside a flickering tallow candle, Jane spread out her sewing earnings, the school's tuition coins, and the household's meager savings, and carefully began to calculate. She wrote numbers on a piece of slate, wiped them away, and wrote them again. Thomas watched her quietly from behind. He had once thought of her as merely a plain-looking wife, but in the wavering shadow cast by the small candle, a deep and unyielding strength he had never recognized seemed to radiate from her. Unaware of her husband's gaze, Jane wrestled with the numbers late into the night before quietly setting down her chalk. As her complex calculations settled into a single clear path. She became certain that the rock-bottom price of the medicinal bark was the perfect opportunity. However, if she announced she was going to use their blood and sweat savings for merchant trading, the fierce scolding of Martha, who highly valued their respectable status, and the disappointment of her scholar husband would surely pour down upon her. Jane's heavy sigh filled the dim, cold stone room. Starting the next day, Jane called upon the brightest young boys attending the parish school. Pressing a few copper pennies and some honey cakes into their small hands, she secretly instructed them to go to the peasant foragers just outside the village limits and buy up the raw willow bark before it even reached the market. Thrilled by the sweet treats from their master's wife, the children eagerly ran through the market alleys every day to carry out her errand. If an adult had swept up all the medicine, it would have immediately caught the eyes of the guild merchants. But the roots, bought by little children, seemingly running errands for their mothers, aroused no suspicion whatsoever. Even Giles, the corrupt guild merchant who held the town's trade in his iron grip, did not spare a single glance at the children's penny trades. While the eyes of the market were perfectly deceived, sacks of the medicinal bark silently began to form a mountain deep inside the manor's dark pantry. Then, one day, Martha opened the heavy wooden door and wrinkled her nose. "What is this smell? The whole house reeks of apothecary herbs." Following the sweet and bitter scent, Martha threw open the pantry door, revealing the towering piles of burlap sacks. "What in heaven's name is all this?" Martha gasped and collapsed to the floor in shock. To think that a respectable family and a scholar's wife were engaging in the lowly work of greedy merchants. She beat her chest and wailed as if in mourning. Hearing the commotion, Thomas came running. He saw the sacks piled in the pantry and remained silent for a long time. Finally, he turned to his wife and asked in a low voice, "Why this bark, of all things?" Jane answered calmly, "My husband, this bark is an essential remedy that must be added to cure any fever or ailment." Her voice was steady, but her eyes shone brilliantly. "The peasant carts have brought too much, and the price is at the very bottom. But soon the heavy rains will come. The cart roads will be flooded. The merchant wagons will be stuck in the mud, and the dampness will rot the unprotected herbs. The supply will be completely cut off. When that happens, the price of this bark will pierce the sky." Thomas, as if realizing something profound, replied, "So if we buy it now while it is cheap?" Jane finished his thought. "It will leave us with a great profit for days to come." Thomas looked at his wife's face for a long time. He was inwardly astonished that a respectable woman sought to sweep up goods and make a profit like a guild merchant. But remembering the skill with which this wife had filled their once empty granary, he could not carelessly oppose her. "Do as you see fit, my wife." Thomas nodded without another word. Martha jumped up and tried to stop her son, but Thomas was firm. "Mother, have you not seen how Jane has kept this household alive? Let us trust her this once." Martha still wore a look of deep displeasure, but she could not argue further against her son's words. A few days later, the sky grew dark and heavy, and at last, the torrential rains began to pour. Before the rain started, Jane carefully dried the bark in the well-ventilated loft above the hearth, safe from the damp, ensuring the harvest would not spoil. She was meticulous, covering them tightly with thick canvas while leaving just enough space for the air to flow so they would not rot. Just as Jane had predicted, the storms dragged on. 10 days passed, then a fortnight, and still the rain showed no signs of stopping. As the supply of herbs to the market square was completely cut off, the apothecaries and the assistants of the monk healers stomped their feet in panic.
The bark has dried up completely, even if we offer twice the shillings.
We cannot find a single ounce. Giles, the powerful guildmaster who controlled the market, sneered. If the price of the herbs went up, he, who controlled the remaining supply, stood to gain the most. But a strange thing happened. Giles' men reported that the market was entirely drained of the bark. It seems some scoundrel has swept up all the goods from under our noses. Giles's eyebrows twitched. What? Who dares to pull such a rat-like trick right under my nose? Giles immediately dispatched his men to interrogate the street peddlers. Giles had lazily left his bulk stock in the lower cellars near the river. Underestimating the impending floods, one quick-witted thug tilted his head and said, "Now that I think on it, for the past few weeks, the boys from the parish school were lingering around the apothecary stalls, buying up the bark. Could it be the work of that poor scholar, Thomas?" Giles's sharp eyes narrowed into slits. At that very moment, Jane noticed strange men lurking around their thatched cottage through the window. Under the cover of night, Jane and Thomas began to move the sacks once again. They divided them perfectly and hid them in places no one would ever look. The darkest corners of the attic, inside empty ale casks, and behind the firewood. My wife, I am afraid not only of losing our honor if these goods are found, but of what harm those ruthless guild thugs might do to us, Thomas said with a worried face. Jane firmly grasped her husband's dirt-stained hands and nodded. I know, but if we step back now, our family will never escape this life of poverty. Jane's eyes did not waver. The signs that the price of the bark would skyrocket were absolute. However, as Giles, the true power of the market, began to watch their humble cottage, a massive dark cloud loomed over the poor scholar and his wife. As the rainy season stretched beyond a fortnight, the price of the white willow bark in the market began to soar. First, it doubled. 4 days later, it tripled. And by the 7th day, it had risen 5-fold. Desperate apothecaries and guild servants wandered everywhere, searching for the herb. But there was none to be found. Then, one night, footsteps were heard at the back door of the cottage. Is the master of the house awake? A strange man bowed low in the darkness. He was an agent for a wealthy apothecary. I heard a rumor that Thomas, though, scholar, has plenty of the healing bark. Please, I beg you to spare some. I will pay whatever price you ask in silver. Jane did not step outside the gate. She answered politely from behind the heavy wooden door. Are you suggesting we have been hoarding goods in this house? Absolutely not. I merely secured a generous amount to brew remedies for my elderly mother-in-law. Jane's voice was as proud as befitted a noblewoman's dignity. "But since your situation is so dire, I shall spare a little for you." Outwardly, she pretended to be generous, but Jane's calculations were flawless. To the merchants overflowing with coin, she strictly applied the absolute highest market price. Without a single word of haggling, heavy pouches of silver shillings and pennies piled up on her apron. And so, a steady stream of people came secretly every night. Within a few days, the strings of silver coins in the corner of the room piled up like a mountain. Seeing this, Thomas opened his mouth in sheer astonishment. "How much is all of this?" "My husband, you must do this first," Jane replied. Instead of answering, she pulled out a bundle of old, sealed parchments from deep inside the wooden chest. They were the usury debts that had been choking the life out of their family. Only when these debts are cleared will this household truly be able to breathe. The next day, the moneylenders came one by one, received their silver, and handed over the parchments. The crushing debt of many years vanished in a single stroke. Martha's herbal remedies became plentiful, and fine white bread baked from pure wheat appeared on their table at every meal. Martha's once harsh glare softened into wide-eyed wonder, and soon she gave a hollow cough and quietly lowered her tail. For a plain-looking thing, you certainly have one extraordinary talent." The venom of the past was completely gone from her voice. But what was truly astonishing happened next. Jane did not sell the remaining bark at a high price. To the poor widow with a sick father, to the frail peasant woman who had just given birth, and to the starving neighbors who stomped their feet because they had no coins for medicine, Jane began to give the remedy away for a few copper, pennies, or on credit. Martha beat her chest and shouted, "No! Why are you giving away such precious goods for nothing? Have you gone mad?" Jane answered calmly, "Mother, emergency medicine proves its true worth not when it is piled up in a storehouse, but when it saves a life. If one chases only wealth, they are but a greedy merchant. But if one saves lives, it becomes a virtue, and virtue always returns to you in the end." At those words, Thomas, who was reading his heavy tomes in the next room, stopped his quill. He realized that this plain-spoken wife of his had a far greater soul than he, who could recite the Holy Scriptures by heart. A profound sense of shame and reverence welled up from the very bottom of his heart. Just as Jane had said, the virtue returned. The neighbors who had received the medicine left baskets of fresh eggs and sacks of fine woven linen and oats in the courtyard. The parish school was no longer just a place to learn letters. It was praised as a place guided by a highly virtuous scholar and a deeply wise mistress. And the sons of wealthy knights and noblemen flocked to it like clouds. Meanwhile, Giles ground his teeth in the market square. He was furious that a poor scholar and his wife had snatched the massive profit that should have been his, but to see them sweep up the goodwill of the entire. The Worcestershire on top of it was unbearable. He harbored a venomous grudge, biding his time. On the other hand, with their newly abundant wealth, Jane handed over the crumbling, thatched cottage to another family and found a proper, a spacious timber-framed house with a grand hearth and a wide hall. On the day they moved, Martha quietly stroked the sturdy wooden beams of the her daughter-in-law's earnings had bought, feeling the immense blessing hidden behind Jane's plain face with her entire being. She finally accepted her daughter-in-law as the true pillar of the family. It was right around that time that grim rumors began to reach them. Word spread that Isabel, the eldest sister, who had boasted of marrying into a wealthy merchant's family, had been cruelly stripped of her keys, locked in a freezing manor tower, and replaced in all but name by her husband's mistresses. Grim rumors reached the village. Word spread that Alice, the second sister, who had proudly married into a wealthy family, had been cast out into the cold streets after her husband squandered their entire estate on ruinous wagers and dice. Jane anxiously sought out her sister's whereabouts, asking travelers and merchants, but Alice had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispers of her tragic fall. On a quiet night in their newly acquired timber-framed house, a warm fire crackled in the grand hearth. Jane sat silently beneath the glow of a tallow candle, her head bowed as she mended a linen tunic. Thomas approached her, his eyes falling upon her hands. They were not the soft, delicate hands of a high-born lady. They were rough, heavily calloused and scarred from endless days of drawing water, scrubbing floors and handling heavy sacks of goods. Thomas reached into his pouch and brought out a small clay jar of rare medicinal balm crafted by monastery monks. He gently took Jane's hands into his own. "My lord!" Jane gasped, startled, and tried to pull her hands away, but Thomas held them firmly. He dipped his fingers into the soothing balm and carefully rubbed it into the deep cracks of her skin. His voice was low and filled with an overwhelming tenderness. "These hands saved our household," he said softly. "I swear to you, I will protect these hands for the rest of my days." It was not an empty promise, but a profound sincerity that pierced straight to her heart. A single tear escaped Jane's eyes, rolling down her cheek as she finally let down her guard. Thomas gently pulled his wife into a warm embrace, and she did not pull away. That night, after months of a cold and distant arrangement, they finally shared their hearts and bodies, forging the true, unbreakable bond of husband and wife. With the parish school thriving and the household secure, Thomas turned his full attention to his delayed studies for his episcopal disputation at the cathedral. By day, he taught the village children in the hall, and by night, he sat by the flickering candle, writing essays on heavy parchment until the wax melted away. Yet, whenever he took up his quill to answer the theological questions, his breath would catch. The examination demanded a solution to relieve the winter famine and cure the corruption of the merchant guilds. But Thomas found himself trapped in the hollow words of dead philosophers. He could not think of a single living, breathing answer. He let out a heavy sigh and dropped his quill. Just then, Jane quietly sat beside him, bringing a wooden tray holding warm, spiced ale and a piece of bread. "My lord, your quill halts like a man." Struggling for his very breath, she noted gently. Thomas nodded in defeat. "You speak the truth, my wife. The crown asks how to fill the bellies of the common folk. But I sit here realizing I do not even know how a single silver penny changes. Hands in the muddy market square. It is a frustrating endeavor. Jane thought for a moment before speaking cautiously. My lord, would you permit me to share what my own 2 eyes have witnessed in the market? When Thomas nodded, Jane's words flowed like a clear stream. When I measured out the rare winter roots, I saw the truth of the people. A starving commoner will secure a warm fire for his hearth before he ever thinks of paying his debts. Survival comes before honor. Even a proud knight who values his noble name above all will pawn his family signet ring for a sack of barley when the winter freeze sets in. Yet the crown authority cares nothing for the empty bellies of the peasants. They only plot how to collect their heavy taxes. And what little silver the poor earn through their sweat is stolen away by the guild masters who take more than half the profit. It is a heartbreaking reality. Her words struck Thomas like a hammer to an anvil. This was not the lofty, detached theory of old monks, but the raw, bleeding truth of the medieval village. He snatched up his quill. As Jane spoke, his hand flew across the parchment without hesitation. That night, the bitter struggles of the starving peasants became the very bone of his essay, breathing true life into his writing. If not for you, Thomas said, looking at her with profound awe, I would have grown old as a foolish scholar, trapped forever in a tower of dusty scrolls. He realized then that his wife was not merely a clever housekeeper, but the very light that awakened his mind. But even as the couple built their hopes, a dark and treacherous plot was being sealed in the damp, smoke-filled back room of a roadside tavern near the market. We must crush that scholar Thomas once and for all, spat Giles, the corrupt guild merchant. He sat across from Simon, the corrupt manor clerk, his eyes gleaming with malice. Giles stroked a pile of empty burlap sacks, each stamped with the bright red wax seal of the sheriff's court. Simon sneered. We will steal the rare willow bark from the sheriff's own storehouse. Then we hide the stolen sacks in the scholar's home and accuse him of thieving from the crown. He will hang, and that will be the end of it. The 2 men laughed wickedly into the night. Yet, the dark alley behind the tavern held an unexpected witness. It was Alice, the second sister, who had been cast out of her wealthy home and was now wandering the muddy streets like a beggar. Hiding behind a wooden barrel, Alice watched in terror as Giles' servant and Simon exchanged the stolen sacks bearing the sheriff's red seal. Her heart dropped, terrified of being discovered. She clutched her ragged wool dress and melted back into the shadows of the rain-soaked lane. A few days later, the morning arrived for Thomas to depart for the grand journey. Cathedral City to present his theological disputation. Jane woke before dawn to pack his leather satchel. She carefully folded his clean linen tunic and packed enough rations for the long journey, loaves of heavy bread, hard cheese, and cured meat. When the bag was tied, Thomas stood before Jane at the front gate. To Jane's absolute shock, Thomas took a step back. He gently took both of her hands, kissed them with deep reverence, and bowed deeply from his waist, offering her the profound respect a chivalric a knight might offer a high-born lady. "My lord, what are you doing?" Jane gasped. Deeply moved by the gesture, a respected parish scholar bowing with such formal devotion to his wife in the open air was a rare sight of pure chivalry. But Thomas was resolute. "If I did not have you, I would not even be walking this path today," Thomas said, his eyes clear and unshakable. "This bow is my knightly vow and my utmost respect to my brilliant wife." It was not a simple farewell. It was a testament of absolute faith in the woman who held up his world. Tears streaming down her face, Jane returned his deep curtsy to accept his heart. "Please, return safely. I will be waiting for you." She stood by the gate, unable to look away until his figure disappeared over the hill leading to the castle road. But no sooner had Thomas left than a shadow fell over the household. Strange men began lurking around the timber cottage, and at night the sound of digging echoed in the yard. Jane knew in her bones that something wicked was approaching their defenseless home. On the morning of the 4th day since Thomas's departure, a loud commotion erupted at the gate. Simon, clad in his official clerk's robes, stormed into the courtyard, followed by half a dozen armed sheriff's deputies. "Is this the house of Thomas the scholar?" Simon barked roughly. Jane stepped forward, her face calm and composed. "It is. For what reason do you intrude upon our land?" Simon sneered. "We have come to answer for the crime of stealing medicinal herbs from the sheriff's storehouse. Men, tear this place apart." At his command, the guards laid waste to the property. They ransacked the grand hall, smashed the clay crocks by the hearth, and turned the pantry upside down. "Here is the stolen property," shouted one of the guards, dragging something from the deep shadows of the kitchen. It was an authentic burlap sack bearing the unmistakable red wax seal of the sheriff. "This is the mark of the crown," Simon roared. "You dared to steal the sheriff's goods to line your own pockets. Seize every sack of winter bark hidden in this house." The deputies began dragging out all the sacks of rare herbs that Jane had, secured through her own blood, sweat, and tears, piling them in the muddy yard. Just then, Martha burst out from the hall, the stern, elderly mother-in-law, who had once been so harsh to Jane, threw her frail arms wide to block the armed men. "What do you think you are doing?" she screamed, her spirit fierce despite her frail frame. "You dare not ransack a noble scholar's home. Step back at once, you curs." But a deputy roughly shoved the old woman aside. Martha fell hard into the dirt, covered in mud, but she continued to curse them. "Do you strike an old woman of a noble house? The wrath of heaven will fall upon you." Simon merely clicked his tongue in mockery. "Ignore the noisy old hag and load the carts." Amidst the chaos and Martha's weeping, Jane bit her lip and maintained a chilling composure. She noticed the discrepancies immediately. The sacks were indeed the sheriff's. Official property, but Jane knew exactly how her own goods were stored. She had intricately woven a hidden blue thread into the interior seam of every sack she owned. These royal sacks lacked her hidden mark. Jane carved these crucial differences into her memory. Once Simon and the guards had hauled away every last sack of herbs, the courtyard looked like a ruined battlefield. Martha collapsed before the empty storehouse, pounding the earth and weeping bitterly. "What are we to do? What are we to do? Everything my daughter-in-law built with her torn hands, gone in an instant." But Jane did not shed a single tear. She walked over to Martha, gently dusted the mud from the old woman's wool gown, and knelt before her. "Mother, it is not over. I will find the proof that the sack they planted is not ours." Martha looked into Jane's unwavering eyes and felt a surge of strength. "Tell me what I must do," the old woman said fiercely. "Mother, I need you to remember the exact number of our sacks those thieves just stole." In that moment, the mother and daughter-in-law became an unbreakable alliance. Suddenly, a weak, trembling voice drifted from the shattered gate. "Jane? Are you there?" Jane rushed over and opened the gate to find a woman, looking like a starved beggar, swaying on her feet. It was her sister, Alice. "Sister!" Jane cried, catching Alice before she could collapse. Alice's condition was pitiful. Jane quickly brought her inside, sat her by the hearth, and fed her a bowl of warm barley soup. After forcing down the food, Alice spoke, her voice shaking. "I heard the village gossip. I heard the sheriff's men raided your house." She lowered her head in shame. "Jane, I have something to confess. A few nights ago, I was hiding in the alley behind the tavern. I saw Giles's servant and Simon the clerk. They were exchanging sacks stamped with the sheriff's red seal." Alice sobbed. "I was too frightened to speak up then. I ran away. I never imagined they were plotting against your home." Jane grasped her sister's hands tightly. "Thank you for coming to me, sister. Your courage means everything." Jane immediately took out a piece of parchment and wrote down every word of Alice's testimony. Hearing the story, Martha struck her knee. "I counted them with my own 2 eyes. The guards hauled away exactly 23 sacks today." Jane nodded, her eyes flashing. "And I saw the truth of their forgery, Mother. The sacks found in our home lacked my personal weaver's mark." The evidence was gathering, but Jane knew it was not enough to challenge the sheriff's court. They needed undeniable proof to break the corrupt clerk. A few days later, John, the ruined old lord, arrived at the cottage after hearing of his daughter's plight. Listening to the entire ordeal, John nodded gravely. "I used to oversee the manor tax rolls in my youth," he explained. Unfurling a blank parchment to demonstrate, if Simon forged the manor ledger to cover the theft, he might have used an incorrect liturgical feast day for the dating, or left traces of scraping the parchment to alter the official tallies. Jane's eyes lit up with hope. That night, by the flickering light of the hearth fire, the 4 of them put their heads together. Alice's eyewitness testimony, Martha's exact count of the stolen goods, Jane's sharp observation of the missing hidden thread, and John's deep knowledge of the manor ledgers. The pieces of the puzzle were finally snapping together. Now, only one thing remained. They needed the man who could weave this evidence into a flawless argument and present it before the sheriff's court. Jane looked out the window toward the royal capital and clasped her hands in prayer. Please, my lord, return to us quickly. The night before, the storm deepened. Several days later, a lone figure covered in the dust of the road stood before the ruined gate of the timber house. It was Thomas, who had ridden day and night after completing his episcopal disputation. But as he pushed open the gate, his face turned pale. The courtyard was violently dug up, and the heavy wooden doors of the storehouse had been ripped from their iron hinges. "Jane!" Thomas shouted in panic, sprinting toward the grand hall. Hearing his voice, Jane rose from the shadows of the room and stepped forward to meet her husband. Though exhaustion weighed heavily on his shoulders, Thomas's eyes burned with a fierce, unwavering light. "You have returned safely, my husband," Jane said softly. "What in heavens has happened here?" Thomas asked, looking at the broken doors of their estate. Jane calmly recounted the events of the past few days. She spoke of the sudden raid by the sheriff's deputies, the discovery of the royal goods, and the confiscation of their rare medicinal roots. As she spoke, Thomas's face grew darker with quiet fury. "That vile merchant Giles has played his hand," he muttered through clenched teeth. Before despair could take hold of him, Jane stepped forward and placed a stack of bound parchment into his hands. "My lord, this is no time for despair." "Look at this," she said. Thomas unrolled the parchment. It was filled with dense, meticulously written notes. It contained Alice's testimony, the specific liturgical errors to watch for in the sheriff's official ledger that John had explained to them, the distinct differences in the sack seams, and the exact dates and quantities of the confiscated goods. Jane had stayed awake through the night by the light of a single tallow candle to compile every piece of evidence. Thomas's eyes widened in astonishment. "Did you gather all of this by yourself?" "My wife?" he asked. "Martha, Sister Alice, and my father helped me." Jane replied with a calm and steady voice. Thomas carefully read through the records his wife had prepared. The more he read, the more his admiration for her grew. "With this, we have more than enough to fight them," he declared. Thomas immediately took up his quill. Using Jane's meticulous notes as his foundation, he began to draft a flawless, logical defense. His sharp, precise words raced across the parchment. The following morning, Thomas made his way to the sheriff's court, accompanied by Jane, Alice, and John. A crowd of villagers and peasants had already gathered in the muddy market square outside the manor hall. Giles stood off to one side, his arms crossed over his fine tunic, wearing an arrogant smirk. He was entirely confident that a poor parish scholar had no means of escaping the trap. "I beg the sheriff for justice against a false accusation." Thomas's voice rang out across the hall. As the sheriff took his seat at the high wooden bench, Thomas stepped forward with unwavering dignity. "It has been claimed that I stole royal goods and hid them in my home. But this is a fabricated lie meant to frame me." Thomas pulled his written defense from his cloak and unfolded it. First, the quantity of the confiscated sacks does not match the dates recorded. In the manor's official ledger, Thomas pointed his quill at the numbers written on his parchment. The manor ledger states that 30 sacks of medicinal herbs were delivered to the royal storehouse on the 20th day of the last month. However, only 23 sacks were found and confiscated from my property. Where, I ask, did the remaining 7 sacks go? The sheriff's brow twitched. The smug smile on Giles's face faltered slightly. Second, the sacks found in our home are indeed the sheriff's property.
But they were planted there, Thomas continued.
At his gesture, Jane stepped forward from the crowd. She held up one of her own sacks. My Lord Sheriff, I weave a hidden blue thread into the interior seam of every sack I own. The royal sacks found in our home lack this mark, proving they were brought from the outside. Jane turned the sacks inside out for all to see. The difference was glaringly obvious to anyone who looked. They claim these royal sacks were found in our storeroom, but it is clear that someone secretly planted them there in the dead of night. A loud murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd of villagers. Third, I have a witness who can testify to exactly who orchestrated this foul plot, Thomas declared. He called Alice forward. Alice's face was pale with fear, but receiving a look of warm encouragement from Jane, she gathered her courage. My lord, Alice began, her voice trembling at first, but soon growing steady. A few nights ago, in the dark alley behind the market square, I witnessed a deeply suspicious exchange. She pointed a shaking finger at the men across the hall. I saw the merchant Giles and the manor clerk Simon meeting in secret. They exchanged a heavy pouch of silver coins and spoke of swapping the royal sacks. They laughed and said that this time the poor scholar's household would be utterly ruined. Alice turned her finger directly toward Giles. That man planned the entire thing. The hall erupted into a chaotic uproar. Giles's face turned the color of a boiled beet. Has this wretched woman gone mad? How dare you speak such baseless lies without proof? He bellowed. You say we lack proof? Thomas shot back, his voice as cold as winter iron. If you cross-examine the official royal ledger, the truth will be laid bare. The sheriff immediately ordered Simon to bring forth the ledger. As the corrupt clerk opened the heavy-bound book, the sheriff's eyes narrowed. Check the liturgical date of the entry, my lord, Thomas added. Simon hastily dated the transport on the feast of St. Michael. But the parish records prove the roads were entirely impassable from floods that day. A true clerk would know this impossibility. Simon's face drained of all color, turning as white as bone. This ledger is a forgery! The sheriff roared like thunder. Giles, you dared to collude with Simon, my own clerk, to forge a royal document and frame an innocent man? For this treasonous crime, you both deserve the gallows. Giles fell to his knees on the cold stone floor, trembling violently. My lord, I am falsely accused, he wept. Falsely accused? With clear witnesses and undeniable proof right before my eyes. How dare you claim innocence? By the sheriff's command, Giles and the corrupt clerk Simon were bound in heavy iron chains. They were sentenced to 30 lashes in the public square and thrown into the deepest, dampest dungeon of the castle. Giles was stripped of his guildmaster title, and Simon was forever banished from serving the crown. Return all the confiscated herbs to Thomas's household at once, the sheriff ordered.
A loud cheer erupted from the crowd of onlookers.
Only then did Jane finally let out a long, trembling breath of relief. It was late afternoon when they returned to their humble timber cottage. The heavy burden of the crisis finally lifted from their shoulders. As the family sat in the main room, sharing a collective sigh of relief, the loud clatter of horse hooves echoed outside their wooden gate.
"Is the master of the house present? A royal writ has arrived from the king's court."
A king's rider handed Thomas a heavy parchment sealed with red wax.
It was the result of his examinations. Thomas had been appointed the first chancellor of the diocese. Thomas's hands shook as he held the parchment.
"I am the first chancellor." Jane walked over and stood by her husband's side. Thomas gripped his wife's hands tightly. "If not for you, my wife, this royal writ would never have reached my hands." Jane did not speak, but offered him a bright, radiant smile. Watching them from the corner of the room, Martha's eyes grew red with unshed tears. Late that night, after a modest celebratory feast of barley bread and warm ale, the house fell quiet. Martha called for Jane in a hushed voice. "Daughter-in-law, come and sit by me." Jane knelt respectfully before her, mother-in-law on the wooden floorboards. For a long time, Martha simply looked at Jane's face in absolute silence. "I was blind," Martha's voice broke, trembling with deep regret. "I called you ugly. I said you were plain and worthless. I treated you so cruelly." Martha reached into the folds of her woolen dress and untied the heavy iron ring of keys that opened the estate's storerooms and granaries. With trembling hands, she gently placed the keys into Jane's palms. "From this day forth, you shall lead this household. This foolish old woman will step back." Tears spilled from Jane's eyes and ran down her cheeks. "Mother, please do not cry. Seeing you weep brings shame to my heart." Martha gripped her daughter-in-law's hands tightly. The long, bitter sorrow of Jane's difficult life under her mother-in-law's roof melted away entirely in the warmth of that single, quiet night. A few days later, a weak and frail voice called out from beyond the timber gate. "Jane, it is me." When Jane opened the door, a woman stood there, shivering in a tattered, mud-stained cloak. It was her eldest sister, Isabel. "Sister!" Jane cried out, rushing forward to support her. Isabel's condition was pitiful. My husband flaunted his mistress in the manor, and when I protested, they stripped me of my keys and locked me in a freezing, crumbling tower. Isabel sobbed, her voice trailing off as bitter tears streamed down her face. Unable to bear the starvation and humiliation, I fled into the bitter night. Without a word of judgment, Jane took her sister's cold hands and led her inside to the warmth of the hearth fire. Sitting by the fire was Alice, who had arrived earlier. Isabel froze when she saw her younger sister. "Alice, you too?" Alice simply nodded, her eyes downcast. The three sisters were finally gathered together in one room. Isabel was the first to speak through her tears. "Jane, we mocked you so terribly. We were so cruel." Alice bowed her head, weeping softly. "I am sorry.
I am so truly sorry. Jane reached out and held both of her sister's hands firmly.
That is all in the past. From now on, we shall live together.
Years passed like leaves on the autumn wind. The drafty timber cottage was replaced by a grand manor house made of strong stone. And Thomas made a great name for himself in the royal capital as a just and incorruptible lord. Behind his wise rulings and his deep understanding of the
Commoner's struggles were always the letters written by Jane.
because his wife wrote to him constantly, detailing the true prices of goods in the market and the daily hardships of the peasants. Thomas never fell into the trap of empty, arrogant nobility. Isabel and Alice remained by their youngest sister's side, helping to manage the vast estate. The two sisters, who had once believed physical labor was beneath them, finally learned the quiet dignity of working with their own hands. Martha lived long enough to see her grandchildren born into the world. The first was a strong boy, and the second, a bright-eyed girl. Martha would sit her grandson on her lap by the hearth fire and smile with pure contentment. "It was your mother who saved this family," she would whisper to the child. One quiet winter, Martha closed her eyes peacefully for the last time. Just before her final breath, she held Jane's hand tightly and whispered, "Because of you, I have seen all the good this world has to offer. Thank you, my daughter." Jane held her mother-in-law's hand and wept for a long time. More years flowed by like a gentle river. On a warm spring afternoon, two elderly figures with silver hair sat side by side on the wooden porch of the manor hall. In the courtyard, their grandchildren were running and laughing under the sun. Jane, holding a small, polished mirror, smiled a wistful smile. "My lord, look at my wrinkles, and as I grow older, these protruding teeth of mine seem to stick out even more." "I am quite a plain sight." Thomas let out a warm, hearty chuckle. "To my eyes, those teeth of yours are the most precious and grandest gates in the entire world." "Grand gates, you say?" Jane asked, raising an eyebrow. "Indeed. Through those gates, great fortune entered my life, and through them, your boundless wisdom flowed out to save our entire family. Every child laughing in that courtyard is there because of you." Jane's eyes grew warm with unshed tears. "You have grown old and talkative, my lord," she teased. As Jane smiled brightly, her protruding teeth caught the golden light of the sun. Finding her utterly beautiful, Thomas wrapped his arm gently around his wife's shoulders. "Flowers may bloom with dazzling colors, but their beauty cannot survive a single harsh frost. Yet a plain earthen crock, built with humble hands, can weather the storms and sustain a family for 100 years. True worth is not found in the fleeting vanity of an outer shell, but in the quiet, enduring strength of a heart that weathers the rain and builds a life through honest sweat and unyielding wisdom." This was the legacy of Jane, a woman who proved that the deepest roots bring forth the most enduring blossoms.